Good morning, everyone. Again, I thank you for opening up your schedules and coming along with me this morning. This is the final morning of our parish mission, and there's some loose ends that we have to gather together before we complete the week. And of course, as you know, 4 days reflecting on such an important topic as relationships, it has not been an exhaustive treatment of the topic. My hopes would be that by looking at what we have reflected on, prayed about, that this has driven home for all of us a reawakening and awareness of this dimension of our life and how important it is. So, before we look at some substantive material this morning, I'd like to make 2 preliminary comments that I think always need to be made when we deal with this topic of relationships. And then, after these few little preliminary comments, we'll look at substantive topics, aspects and issues this morning. The first of these little preliminary comments that I would want to make is to simply say it's good for all of us, if not very important for all of us, to periodically step back from this world of our relationships that we have with one another and be appreciative again and again of what this dimension of our life has to offer. This is the fundamental aspect of life. You've heard me say, at least at one point in the course of the week, that it's within this area of relationships that we experience some of the greatest joys of life, but it's also true to say it's within this area of relationships that we experience unbelievable pain and difficulty and sometimes awful, awful defeat. And I would hope that what we have looked at together this week has reawakened, if that's necessary, reawakened an appreciation. Because these relationships are great blessings. They're not easy. Why? Because we are not angels, we are human beings. And you cannot put 2 of the holiest people in the world together in a relationship and not have times of conflict and struggle and difficulty. It goes with the territory because we are not perfect people. And there is no such thing as a perfect marriage, a perfect family, a perfect relationship, a perfect priest, whatever. We are all imperfect. But quoting Cardinal Newman, who was one of my great heroes, and thanks be to God, the Church canonized him this past year. Newman is famous for his little adages. And one of the adages that Newman always said is that God is not pleased with success. He's pleased with effort. And so we keep making the effort and making the effort because this collection of relationships that we have been given are great gifts. And we want to do everything we can so that these relationships can be deepened and appreciated. So they're great blessings, but they're not easy. The second preliminary comment that I would want to make, and I think this is important, that we have to come to acknowledge that every one of us, in some way, shape, or form, is strange and peculiar and weird. I hope that this is not new information. We are all strange and peculiar and weird. And sometimes we come to each other with all of our idiosyncratic behaviors and our peculiarities, and we just dump those on each other and expect everybody else to pick up the pieces, when often I will not pick up the pieces of my own strangeness and my own weirdness. Whatever Adam and Eve did in that garden, whether it was indeed something like eating a piece of fruit, or that was symbolic of some enormously worse thing that they did. They fractured and ruptured not just humanity, but all of creation. That's why St. Paul says in one of his letters, all creation is groaning to be delivered from what Adam and Eve had done. And by virtue of that original sin, we are all strange and peculiar, and it is a sign of maturity in the life of a person who deals with other people in the intimate relationships, marriage, family, friendship, or even more broadly, and all the other relationships. It is a sign of maturity in a person that they learn how to tame, and they learn how to control, and they learn how to discipline whatever it is in them that drives other people away. It is a task that we have to make, quoting Newman, the effort to engage in this day after day after day, so that we just don't create these relationships. Granted, they're blessings, and yes, they're difficult, but we make them even more difficult than they ever need to be, because some people think it's a joke to dump on other people their strangeness, their weirdness, and their idiosyncratic behaviors. And there's no discipline, there's no control, and there's no taming of their weirdness. They think they're entitled to do this. We're not entitled to do it. We have to work on ourselves. With those two preliminary comments in the back of our heads, then let's look this morning at some substantive material. And because this is the last morning, the last day that we will be together, you'll be happy to hear me say, I don't want to make 4 points this morning. I only want to make 3. Aren't you happy? But I must be honest with you. There are 3 subdivisions under each of the 3 points. So that's where I'm going this morning. And the first of the 3 points is to acknowledge how difficult it is today to create, to deepen, and to build healthy relationships. They are great blessings, but I must say that there are militant forces out there in the culture, out there in the world, and they seem to be hell-bent on destroying our relationships, especially long-term relationships like marriage and family and friendship, those relationships that nourish us and give us life, that there are dark, dark forces. Now, you heard me say already this week that I would be the last priest on the face of the earth to categorically dismiss American culture and say there's nothing of value. That is not accurate. There's great value, great blessings, great benefits that come to us, and we must protect these. Protect them and secure them. Democracy is an extremely fragile institution, and therefore we have to protect it, deepen its roots, and so forth. But despite the fact that we're in a great culture and living in a great country, there are dark and destructive forces that seem to be hell-bent on destroying us and destroying this networking of relationships. And what are some of these dark and destructive forces? Let me mention, for brevity's sake, because there's a lot of them, let me mention for brevity's sake 3 of these dark and destructive forces. The first of these is what I would call alienation. And that word sounds very philosophical, consequently very theoretical, almost pedantic. The lived experience of what I mean by alienation is not theoretical or pedantic or academic. What I mean by alienation is that way too many of us have arrived at the erroneous posture of turning around to the rest of the gang and saying to them, thank you very much for your offer of help, but the fact of the matter is, I don't need you. I have everything within myself to make a go of life. This is profoundly erroneous thinking. Why? Because this attitude of alienation, excessive individualism, I don't need anyone except myself, this attitude of alienation flies in the face and attempts to invalidate the fundamental principle upon which everything that God has created rests. And that principle was articulated way, way back in the Middle Ages by great intellectual minds, great saints, Thomas Aquinas, Saint Bonaventure, Saint Anselm, the great Benedictine doctor of the church. It's called the principle of exchange. And what does that mean? You have talents and you have abilities and you have life experiences that Simeon Gallagher will never have. On the other hand, in his mysterious way of doing things, God has given Simeon Gallagher talents and abilities and life experiences that you will never have, but these do not make Simeon superior to you, and yours don't make you better than Simeon. The task is that we would come to the realization of exchanging the principle of exchange, exchanging these talents, abilities, and life experiences with one another so that we can all progress, we can all grow, and we can become these healthy, well-rounded kinds of people that God wants us to be. In essence, the principle of exchange means I need you to become all that God wants me to be, and you need me to accomplish the same thing in your journey. And alienation comes along and says, you don't need anybody but yourself. Nothing that God has created, nothing has been created to stand alone. Everything is interconnected. It's all of a piece. And Pope Francis, whom I believe is the Holy Spirit's greatest gift to the modern church and the world, has reminded us over and over and over again. We must create social networking. We must come again to discover each other in the world of our relationships, and not just in the human relationships, but that the way these human relationships are connected to the environmental world that is all around us, because the environment is a mirror of the principle of exchange. When you look out the windows of this lovely church, you do not see just one tree. You see an ecosystem. When you look at the stars in a clear Wyoming night, you do not just see one star. You see a stellar system. Everything is interconnected. And that's the way God has put it together. And alienation comes along and says, that's not true. You don't need anybody but yourself. It's profoundly damaging. Look at nature. Look at creation. When I was a kid growing up in Philadelphia, my mom and dad, as you've heard me say, they came from Ireland, and so did some, but not all of their brothers and sisters. Most of them settled in Philadelphia. Those who got married, my mother had a sister who was a nun. Most of them got married and had families, and they all went together every summer. and rented an old dilapidated house in Cape May, New Jersey, which is one of the beach communities on the southern coast of New Jersey. As a youngster, I spent all of my summers. I have nothing but happy memories of my childhood. Later on, when we got older, my brother and I and the rest of our cousins, they made us work while we were at Cape May. But I remember being no more than maybe 5 years of age, my dad had me by the hand. And we were walking on the beach in the surf on an August afternoon. Curious little kid that I was, I asked my dad, what makes the water come and go? What makes the water rise and fall? I don't think I used the term, because it wasn't part of my 5-year-old vocabulary. But I was asking my father, what creates the tides? And my dad said to me, the moon. In my little pre-scientific 5-year-old mind, I couldn't comprehend how something so far away in the sky and something that only came out at night had anything to do with what was lapping at the bottom of my feet on the beach that August afternoon. I went away to seminary high school. We began to study the physical sciences, and I discovered that my father's answer was correct. In fact, I discovered the man was correct about a number of things. It is the moon in its lunar orbit that creates the gravitational pull in the cosmos that rocks the ocean water back and forth. The moon shows its power in the restlessness of the seas, and the seas depend upon the moon for their movement. The principle of exchange. Everything that God has created is interlocking, and that's why this attitude of alienation is so destructive in the construction and in the maintenance of healthy relationships. Here's the second dark and destructive force. It's materialism. And I want to be very, very clear about this, because the problem with vocabulary today is that everybody hears a word and then loads the word with all of their own impressions. What I mean by materialism is that we live in a world, and this world demands things of us, and we have to be very, very careful that these things do not supersede our relationships with each other. We live in an incredibly materialistic world, and we are grateful that we have what we need with technology and everything else to further our journey, to make our life easier with all of the inventions, etc., that began with the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. But we have to be very, very careful that we do not hand ourselves over to things and fail to interact with each other. Francis of Assisi, if there's one contribution that he made and that the Franciscan order has made since the 12th century to the church, but also to the world, it is the importance of the human person. The tale is told that St. Francis, he loved animals, and indeed he did. He spoke to the birds when he preached. He tamed ferocious wolves that were destroying flocks of sheep. He had an incredible affection for animals. But listen to this, because this is something that even we Franciscans often fail to remember. Francis said, respect all of creation. Thank God for the beauty of the creatures that are part of that. But things like dogs and cats, etc., they are to be kept outside. No animals, no dogs, no cats, etc., inside the friary. And why is that? Because in my life, I have been a Capuchin Franciscan for over 53 years, I have lived in friaries where there is a dog or there is a cat, and the friars come down, some of them, to breakfast in the morning. They're total and complete grumps. They cannot tell you good morning unless they've had 18 gallons of caffeine fed into their system intravenously. And they're sitting like total grumps, not saying good morning to any of the friars, and the friary dog comes walking through. And suddenly this friar, who hasn't greeted the friars, is down on all fours, talking baby talk to the friary dog. Francis said, they have a place, it's outside, there should be no of these animals in the house, because he did not want the displacement of affection between the friars, because there was an animal in the house. And this materialism that we are dealing with in an ever-increasing fashion is taking us away from one another. You've seen this, and maybe all of us, God forgive us, have done this. You're involved in a conversation with another person, and suddenly, I'm sorry, let me take this call. I'm sorry, I have to answer this call. Excuse me, what about the person standing in front of us? What does this do? It devalues human relationships in place of a cell phone. We have to keep an awareness of this stuff. I have a cousin at home in Philadelphia. If she knew I was talking about her this morning, she'd kill me. She's a widow. Her husband was a firefighter, and he lost his life. This is many, many years ago. And he left her with 6 kids. She raised these kids by herself. She became a nurse in order to pay the bills, etc. And she's one of these people, and you know them. When they do something, even the most simple of tasks, they do it with taste. They do it with care. They do it with a kind of culture and sophistication, even if it's something as simple as setting the table. And she called me last Thanksgiving night, and I could tell from the tone in her voice that she was disturbed about something. And she said to me, I had all of the family to my house for Thanksgiving dinner this afternoon. And knowing her, she prepared for that dinner 2 weeks before, making sure that everything, the silver and the china and the linen and everything, were polished and clean for the table. She took some time, I'm sure, to get appropriate wines for the adults. I'm sure she selected a lovely little bouquet of flowers for the center. Everything that the woman does, she does with taste, appreciation, and culture. That's just the way she is. And she said to me, I had everybody at the table. She said this was the first time that we didn't seat the teenagers at the card table. We had them sitting at the table. And she said, I noticed halfway through the meal that none of the teenagers were engaged in any of the conversation. Why? Because they were under the tablecloth with these gadgets. And she said, I lost my cool. I said to them, how dare you do this? It has taken me days upon days to prepare this meal. And here you are under the tablecloth, pushing these gadgets. Who were you speaking with? And to her horror, she discovered that all of the teenagers in her family around the dinner table were communicating with each other under the tablecloth. That's the point of materialism. Enjoy the things that we need, have the things that are demanded of us, but don't lose ourselves. And she said to me at the end of the conversation, I don't know what I'm going to do about this. I said, well, I can give you a suggestion. if you're going to go through this rigmarole next year and have all of them come to your house for Thanksgiving dinner, when you invite them, you tell them, kids as well as adults, there will be a big basket inside the front door of your house. And when they come into the house, they throw all of these phones and all of these gadgets into that basket. They can pick them up on the way back out. And I said to her, if they don't agree with that, then disinvite them. It's a lack of appreciation. It's a lack of respect. We're turning to things rather than to one another. And that materialism is a significant dark force in our culture that's pulling us away from each other. And what's the third dark and destructive force? It's an attitude, and the attitude is defeatism. Go back to what I said in the morning, in the beginning of this morning's reflection. Even the best of relationships has times of conflict and struggle and difficulty. If my response to difficulties and struggles and problems in a relationship is to throw in the towel, wipe my hands and throw in the towel, and walk away from another person, whoever that person might be, I'm going to wake up when it's too late to discover that what I have thrown away has been one of the most precious gifts that God could ever give to me, and that's the gift of this relationship with this other person. Granted, some of these relationships, they have to end. I'm a priest, and in my years in the priesthood, I have been pastor of parishes several times. We get these couples ready for marriage, ask them to cooperate for 6 months. It becomes glaringly clear that some of these couples should not marry each other. But they go ahead and get married. If they don't get married in the church, then they find some other venue and go into these marriages, and these marriages, they're time bombs. Ticking, 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 and then they explode in their faces. It's perfectly clear that some marriages have to end because of the abuse, the diminishment of a person in that relationship, because of the selfishness and the narcissistic attitudes of the other spouse. They have to end because they're so destructive. But having said that, to throw in the towel and to walk away without even trying, without even making the effort, getting the counseling, listening to wisdom people, etc., this attitude of defeatism has permeated the human community, and it's destroying our capacity to relate to one another. And the worst form of this defeatism is not when I throw in the towel in a relationship with you. The worst form of this defeatism is when I give up on myself. Throw in the towel on myself and walk away. How does this manifest itself? A lack of accountability and a lack of personal responsibility for the way that I live my life. Blame everybody else. You're responsible for my difficulties. It's defeatism. You will remember this famous case. Here is an individual rushing to work on a Monday morning, traffic crazy as all get out, and this individual stopped at McDonald's to buy a cup of coffee and bought a large cup of coffee and took it into the car. There is something in the car which is there by design. It's called a cup holder. It is not there for loose change. It is not there for additional keys. It is not there for rosary beads. It's there for a cup. And this individual Obviously, the cup holder was filled with cigarette butts or whatever. This individual put the coffee cup between the legs, and traffic being what it is, they had to suddenly brake the car, and the steaming hot cup of coffee poured all over them and scalded them. And what did they do? They sued McDonald's, as if McDonald's was responsible for their stupidity. McDonald's did not tell them to put the cup between their legs, but they couldn't accept personal accountability and personal responsibility. They throw in the towel on themselves and they blame McDonald's. These three dark and destructive forces, they are destroying our capacity to build better relationships. What were the three again? Alienation. Thanks a lot, but I can do it on my own. Materialism. I'm sorry, but I have to take this call. I'm sorry, but let me take... What about the person standing in front of us? And then this defeatism, and we're even finding this in our young people. I'm sure you are aware that we are dealing in this country this morning with an epidemic of teenage suicides. I would be the last priest on the face of the earth to pass judgment. I have lost one of my own cousins through suicide. Who knows what goes on, if there's any reasoning at all, but who knows what goes on in the person's head who only thinks of ending their life because they can't figure a way of going around or through it. But nevertheless, we have kids holding hands and jumping in front of oncoming locomotives on the Long Island Railroad. Kids jumping off of trestle bridges up in Washington State for the experience of the free fall and their death. Again, I'm not passing judgment, but we find this even in our kids. We find it, you're familiar with this. I am familiar with this. We have so many suicides in our American military community. The Pentagon doesn't want us to know this, but the families who bury these soldiers do know it. Throwing in the towel for whatever reason and walking away and giving in to defeatism. There are monumental issues that we all have to face. But that takes me back to alienation. We cannot handle these monumental issues if any one nation thinks that they're better than any other nation, or one individual thinks that they're better than... We have to work together. I would quote Abraham Lincoln. The country that does not work together, struggle together, suffer together, and pray together is a nation that perishes together. The first point this morning is to appreciate the beauty and the power of these relationships and to recognize the dark and destructive forces that seem to be hell-bent to destroy them. Here is the second point this morning, and it's the theological point. Why do you and I, as believing women and men, why do we value and treasure these relationships? Because, not just because of psychotherapists who would say, you've got a good marriage, you're going through a rough patch, do not throw in the towel and walk away. Thanks be to God, by the way, we have these professional, clinical people. And we should never be ashamed to turn to them, because we create impasses in our obstinacy, in our obdurateness. We create obstacles that hinder the growth of a relationship. We need to turn to people who, like referees in a football game, can break open and teach us compromise, communication, the value of conversing. We need these kinds of people. But it's not on the basis of these clinical people that you and I value in relationships. They're rooted in our faith. You've heard me say this already this week. This is kind of a gathering together of some of the loose ends. But there are three things that we believe in the Christian, in particular Roman Catholic tradition of Christianity, that reinforce the world of our relationships. And the first of these is that God himself exists in a relationship, which we call the Blessed Trinity. If God himself coexists consubstantially in the Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, with the flow and the progression and the interaction of all three persons in the Trinity, that is a manifestation of the value of community. And as we struggle, as we build, as we grow in appreciation, we become existential manifestations and revelations of the very inner life of God himself, which is a life of relationships and community. The Trinity reinforces the value of our relationships. Secondly, we value these relationships by virtue of the incarnation. When the Word became flesh, he dwells among us and has even said, if you want to find me, look for me where 2 or 3 of you are gathered together in my name. I am there in your midst. We find him in community. We find him in each other by virtue of the incarnation. Go home this morning. Open up your Bible and find the 2nd chapter in Paul's letter to the Philippians, where we are told, even though he was God, he did not cling to his divinity, but he emptied himself, finding himself in human form, and in human form within community. We value relationships because when the Word became flesh, he dwells among us. And therefore we value, esteem, honor, respect, love this great gift of relationships that God has given us, because God himself chose to come among us in the context of relationships. He came into the world in the context of two fundamental relationships: marriage, Joseph and Mary, and family, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus of Nazareth. He could have come. In fact, many people believed that when the Messiah comes, he's going to come at the head of a great army, like a commander-in-chief. He's going to throw out the Roman forces. This was the concept of the coming of the Messiah in ancient Judaism. He didn't come like that at all. He came as a tiny child, born in the middle of the night, dependent on a woman and a man, Mary and Joseph, protected and secured by them. It's all about relationships, and the incarnation is an affirmation in faith of the value of these relationships. And the third reason, in faith, and this is peculiar to the Catholic community, we believe that the world of our relationships is reinforced in the sacrament of the Eucharist. That Jesus gives himself to us. This is my body. This is my blood. Why does he do this? So that nourishing you and me with the bread of his own body and the liquid of his own blood. And it's the real presence of Jesus. This is not symbolic. This is not metaphorical. He didn't say at the Last Supper, this is like my body, this is like my blood. He said, this is my body. This is my blood. Take and receive. For what reason? So that being nourished by God, we can take the gift of God out and nourish the world that is around us. There are social implications of the Eucharist. There are political ramifications of the Eucharist. It is not just Jesus and me. It's Jesus feeding me so that I can feed the hungers of the world. And that is not Simeon Gallagher's personal theology. This is the theology of the Eucharist that comes to us from the Second Vatican Council. And this is a beautiful articulation of a famous homily that was given by Fulton Sheen, Bishop Sheen, way back in 1976 at the International Eucharistic Congress in Philadelphia. Fulton Sheen gave a homily. He said, the world is filled with hungers. Yes, the hunger for physical food, but the world is filled with the hunger for communion, for belonging. The world is filled with the hunger for love. And we must feed these hungers. And we feed them through the beauty of the Eucharist. This is not an empty sacrament that we come and stare at. This is a huge contribution in Eucharistic theological development that comes from the Second Vatican Council. The Eucharist is not a sacrament that we come and stare at. It is an action that entails the totality of us, so that when we come, for example, to Mass in the morning, we participate. We participate. Everybody has a role to play. The priest, the choir, the congregation, the ushers. We're all doing this as God's people. And the Eucharistic celebration in a parish on a Sunday morning ought to be a reflection of the parish's life. And thanks be to God, I can say this to you this morning. And I'm not being artificial, and I'm not playing. I love to have seen all the way through last weekend, and even in the morning, people coming in and dressing the altar, making sure the books are laid out. Elizabeth has helped us to pick little songs. She came to me on Monday morning. She said, we have a tradition here of singing. I'm grateful. This is people participating, building the worship event together. Why do we value relationships? Because of the Trinity, because of the Incarnation, and because of the Eucharist. And that takes me to the third and final point this morning. Again, to be practical, to satisfy my dad, who always said to me, if you're going to become a priest, don't send people home with a bunch of lovely ideas in their head. Send them home with something concrete to think about. And so the third point this morning, what do you and I need to do so that these relationships in which we are involved with each other can become deeper realities? It seems to me that we need to pray to God every day for 3 graces. And every time you find a happy marriage, every time you find a family that's functional rather than dysfunctional, and every time you find a nourishing friendship, all of these beautiful, you will find these 3 realities. But I don't want to call them the 3 dimensions of a good relationship, the 3 characteristics of, I want to use a theological term, graces, because these do not come on their own. We have to ask God to give us these graces, and He does give them to us. There are lots and lots, millions and millions of happy marriages, millions and millions of blessed and happy families, and unbelievable numbers of solid and life-giving friendships. We're not left without this. But to deepen what we've got, let's ask God every day, first of all, for the grace of a compassionate heart, The grace of a compassionate heart. Go back with what I said earlier this morning. Whatever Adam and Eve did in that garden, when they disobeyed God and created this rupture, this fracturing and this splintering of all creation, one of the manifestations of that rupture, that fracturing is, let's be honest, there is a mean streak in me, and I'm going to suspect that there's a mean streak in each of you. And that mean streak divides, creates antagonisms and all the things that we're dealing with. And it's a poison. It's a poison that destroys relationships, families, marriage. It can be a poison that can destroy a parish. And because it is a poison, it needs an antidote. And the antidote to the poison of the mean streak is the grace of a compassionate heart. That as I deal with you, even though we might have differences, we are tender, we are sensitive, we are respectful of where we're all coming from in our own individual perceptions of the world and of life. And to be able, nothing needs this compassionate heart more than, for example, in the life of an older couple, when one of those people is suffering and struggling, that the other person makes every concerted effort to step inside that suffering, step inside that woundedness, and say to the other person, you're not in here alone. I'm with you, and you can count on me to never abandon you. The grace of a compassion. I give retreats to priests. And one retreat that I gave, this is several years ago, in another part of the country, there was a priest in that diocese. He was an older gentleman, one cantankerous, miserable, negative old character. And they sent a beautiful, prayerful, generous, loving young priest to be the assistant pastor with this cantankerous character. This should never have happened. But the church, as an institution, can we not accept this and deal with this? It's divinely founded, but it's run by human beings. And the church's history is marked by institutional stupidity. And this is a classic example of institutional stupidity. They sent this beautiful, gifted, grace-filled young man to be the assistant pastor with this cantankerous individual filled with anger and rage. For 6 months he put up with this. He told me this himself. He came, the bishop had said to him, Gallagher's coming next week to give the guys their retreat, and I've known that bishop for years. Long before they ever made him a bishop, he and I served together on national boards for priests. So the bishop said, Gallagher's coming next week. So he made an appointment and came in and visited with me. And he said, I didn't go into the bishop's office to trash Father so-and-so. I simply went in to ask for a transfer. But he said, I didn't realize how close to the surface all of the struggle and all of the pain that I have been going through for the last 6 months. I didn't realize how close to the surface. And he said, suddenly, I began to cry. He said, I was so mortified. I'm 26 years of age. I'm sitting in the boss's office, and I'm crying like a kid, and I couldn't stop. He said, I put my head in my hands on my side of the bishop's desk, And I just wept and wept and wept. And I said to him, "What did the bishop say?" And I will never forget that young priest's answer. And to be honest with you, it still moves me. He said the bishop didn't say anything. But when I looked up, through my tears, the bishop was crying with me. If we cannot enter into each other's pain, if we cannot be there for each other, when there is woundedness and struggle, what in the name of God is the future of these relationships? There is no future, because we will eat each other alive with that mean streak. We need to pray to God every day for this grace of a compassionate heart. And the second grace to be prayed for is the grace of an open mind. This is one of the great gifts that God has given to us. You've heard me say this somewhere along the line this week, quoting Bernard Lonergan, the great Jesuit Canadian theologian, who talks about life using the image of an horizon. That when we come in to the beginning of life, little infants, tiny, tiny little horizon, they only want to be fed. They only want to be warm. They only want to be held. They only want their diapers to be changed. Their horizon looking out over their little faces, small and narrow. But in the journey of life, with events, people, achievements, setbacks, accomplishments, defeats, that horizon, it should be growing, growing, so that the oldest person in this church this morning should have the widest horizon. But you know as well as I do that in so many cases that is not the case. So many people, having lived long lives, end their life with an horizon that's even smaller than the horizon with which they arrived. We need to ask God every day for the second grace, and that's the grace of an open mind, because that way we can listen, we can learn, we can speak, we can share, we can work on things together, we can attack issues and problems that need to be addressed. We can, because I'm not afraid to hear the opinions of other people. And I'm not afraid to articulate my own opinions, and most importantly, to, if I have these opinions, to articulate them respectfully, intelligently, and in an organized fashion, and not just to shout my impulsive opinions. An open mind, so that we can together attack the issues that address us. We need to pray to God every day and be delivered from the curse of a narrow mind. Even the church in her beauty, and I'm sure you are aware of this, Fulton Sheen always used to say, the Catholic Church is a woman with 7 different dresses, because we have in the Catholic Church rites, as we call them, R-I-T-E-S, and these are ways of worship, ways of dressing for the Eucharist. They go way, way back in the ancient history of our church, and consequently, the Roman rite of the Roman Catholic Church is the largest, but we have the Byzantine rite that comes out of the Ukraine, the Maronite rite that comes out of Lebanon, the Ambrosian rite that comes out of Milan and St. Ambrose. We have the Coptic rite that comes out of Ethiopia. We have all, and Pope Benedict XVI has created an additional rite, and that is for Episcopalian people who have converted and have come over to Roman Catholicism, and they can continue to worship in the way that they are comfortable worshiping when they were Anglicans or Episcopalians. They have to acknowledge the primacy of the Pope in their transition over into Roman Catholicism and many of the other aspects of Catholic belief. But let them worship the way they've all. These rites, the Church is herself an organization filled with diversity and shows the creativity and the incredible development of imagination that God has given to us. We need to ask for the grace of an open mind and not be afraid to hear each other's statements and opinions. Why am I mentioning this? Because this has ramifications today in the great struggle that the world, not just America, that the world is engaged in when there are millions and millions and millions of people all over the world in movement, as immigrants. We are not the only country that's dealing with immigration. And this fear, rather than respect, yes, they have to come legally for their own protection. But to be afraid, as Pope Francis said when he spoke to the Congress 4 years ago when he made his visit to the United States, he said, unless you are Native Americans, as we gather in this chamber, unless you are Native Americans, every single one of us is the result of immigration. And therefore, this has implications and ramifications and open-mindedness. And here is the third and final grace to be prayed for. And that's the grace of an imaginative spirit. The grace of an imaginative spirit means that we bring and make the effort to bring life, nourishment, enthusiasm, zeal to these wonderful, wonderful gifts that God has given to us in the world of our relationships. Because like everything else, relationships can be subjected to gravitational pull. We can become like water, seeking the lowest level. And we want these to be life-giving